On behalf of the Monday night lecture program, I'd like to welcome everyone to Ayelet HaShachar. It's a great honor for us to have Rabbi Teller addressing us. I have the fortune of having some family connection to Rabbi Teller, and I don't just know Rabbi Teller, I know some of his children, some of his sons, friends, chavrusas, and family. And I think what's unique about Rabbi Teller that he's come to speak with us this evening is that we have, within the Torah or Jewish world, we have Torah personalities, Torah educators, and on the other hand, you also have historians, people who are very fluent with the history, with the background of the Jewish people, those that specialize in the Holocaust. I think what's unique about Rabbi Teller is that he is a Torah educator par excellence, whether it's through the written word or through his world-famous speeches. But it's coming with a very strong background and specialization.
I don't think the mic's working.
It's on.
Okay. I think I'm not working. And having that synthesis of a Torah educator together with a very strong background in history, it's a very huge opportunity that we have Rabbi Teller coming all the way from Jerusalem tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Rabbi Teller to come address us.
Thank you very much. If you can hear me without the mic, it'll be a little more. You need the mic, okay. All right. Thank you very much. After this introduction, I even want to hear what I have to say. I walked in here and I was so impressed. Everyone is so early, and then I never come late. I thought it was 8:50, and I didn't realize it's 8 o'clock. So I apologize for my delay, unwittingly.
The mic's working.
The mic is working.
I don't think so.
It's definitely working.
Sometimes this helps. How's that? All right. There was a black painter, African-American painter, who was painting the home of my friend, Yussel Chapnick. Yussel passed away during COVID. He lives in a very religious neighborhood in Brooklyn called Borough Park. And before they painted the home, they were taking all the paintings and the pictures and blow-ups on the wall off the wall. It would have been rather moronic, imbecilic, and idiotic to leave them on the wall. And one of the blow-ups was a picture of the Baba of a Rebbe, who's the largest. It's a Hasidic neighborhood, and he has the largest Hasidut, the largest court in all of Borough Park. And the black painter said to my friend Yussel, he said, "Is this your rabbi?" He said, "No." He said, "Why isn't he your rabbi?" "He's not my rabbi. Let's get on with the job." "But why isn't he? He's not my rabbi. Can we get on with the job?" He said, "Why isn't he? He's not my rabbi." Look at the wall. There's so many rabbis, beards, payas. They look all very rabbinic. He's one of them. He said, "But why isn't he your rabbi?" "He's not my rabbi. Can we get on with the job?" And then the black painter said, "He's my rabbi." He said, "What?" And then he pulled out his wallet, ripped out a photograph of the Baba of a Rebbe. He said, "What the?" I said, "I'll tell you." He said, "One morning I was painting the house. The Rebbe came home. He said to me, 'Did you have breakfast?' I said, 'No.' He said, 'Sit down.' He waited upon me. Then he said to me, 'I want to tell you something.' And I knew just what he was going to say. I heard the schmooze 1,000,000 times. He's going to tell me, 'I'm paying you good money. I want a perfect job.' And the Rebbe said, 'We once had the world of perfection. And everything was the way it was supposed to be. But because of our sins, the temple was destroyed. And ever since we haven't had that perfection, and thus I cannot ask you to do a perfect job. I would like you to try your hardest.' And you know how his people recommend? He gave me hundreds of his chassidim. No one ever offered me breakfast, but they all say to me, 'I'm paying you good money. I want a perfect job.' And I say to them, 'You want a perfect job? There's no temple. How do you want a perfect job?" So sometimes it's easier for an outsider to grasp what we have a harder time to grapple with. And it's a perennial phenomenon. At the turn of the century, and I don't mean 23 years ago, the Ritvaz, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. The Ritvaz was a giant of a rabbinic luminary who, at the end of his life, lived in Tzfat. He wrote a very famous commentary on the Yerushalmi. And he was in Chicago, and the chief rabbi of New York, I note the first and the last, I suspect first and last, chief rabbi of New York, Rav Yaakov Yosef, passed away, and they extended an invitation to Rav Yaakov Yosef, would you please be the next rabbi? And he made a simple geographic calculation. He lived in Chicago. He wanted to live in Israel. New York was on the way, so he agreed to stop off along the way in New York. He arrived in New York, 1903, and just then was the Kishinev pogrom, the big daddy of all the pogroms. And there were many Jews in New York who had come from Kishinev. And they decided that what they were going to do to raise money for the victims of the pogrom in Kishinev, Moldova, they would have a ball, and the proceeds would go to the victims in Kishinev. Now, this is not a very good shiva. It's not a good matchup to have proceeds from a ball to go for the victims of, but that's what they did. And they had a dilemma. The dilemma was that it was customary at that time, whenever you had a Jewish function, Jewish defined by the fact it was on behalf of Jews, you invite the rabbi. But how in the world could they invite the rabbi to a dance Saturday night with Meidlich and Freilich and everything going on? This rabbi, he's not going to feel comfortable. And yet, it was a Jewish affair, and they hit upon the following compromise. They stuck an invitation under his door Friday afternoon. They figured they'd technically invite him before the event, but it would be too late for him to change his plans. So come Saturday night, at the ball, there's dancing and girls and men, and everything is like a ball is a ball. And then, at 5 to 12, the Ritvaz walked in with a long black coat and a hat large enough to be a manhole cover. And everyone goes, shh. He goes over to the grandstand and tells them, quiet. He tells the following story. There was a Jew who lived all the way out in Provence in the woods. And he hired a malamed, a teacher for his son, to teach him the ways of Judaism. And he noticed that this teacher had very unusual ways, this malamed. He would get up in the middle of the night, sit on the floor, tip his hat forward, begin to moan and say this humble jumble. And finally he approached me and said, tell me, what are you doing every night at midnight? He said, the temple is destroyed. We mourn the temple, and we wish it to be rebuilt. And therefore we say Tikkun Chatzot, we say this prayer that God should speedily rebuild it in our day. And the farmer got so excited, he said, wow, I never heard of this mitzvah, can I do it also? He said, sure. What do I have to do? Just get up at midnight. So he gets up, he said, what do I do now? Sit down on the floor, tip your hat, take off your shoes, said, wow, a new mitzvah, let's drink a l'chaim. That is totally inappropriate. We're mourning the destruction of the temple. Come on, let's drink a l'chaim. No. Think about the fact the temple is destroyed. That's why we have Shabbos B'Tammuz. That's why we have it 3 weeks. And now we have to commemorate the destruction of the temple. But let's make a l'chaim. We don't get mitzvahs like, come on, just sit down. Anyways, at 2:30 in the morning, the farmer's wife woke up. She saw the farmer and the malamed dancing in the kitchen. The temple's destroyed, l'chaim, the temple's destroyed. Said the Ritvaz, Kishinev is destroyed, l'chaim, and they stomped out. So I wanted to speak a little bit, we're into 3 weeks, just about, most speakers, when they speak, we know we lost the first temple, we lost the second temple. And the rabbis teach us we lost the first temple because of 3 cardinal sins, sexual crimes, pagan worship, and murder. And the second temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred, one Jew towards his brother. And most speakers always speak about the baseless hatred. And I think the reason is because if someone would have committed one of the crimes of murder, sexual crimes, pagan worship, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize you've done something terribly wrong. But when you have baseless hatred, there's not that overwhelming sense I've done something horrible. Furthermore, everybody thinks they have the baseless hatred. My hatred is legitimate. That's the way many people think. going to skip a little bit, not that you would know. If we don't focus on what we've lost, now I'm going back to the first temple. If we don't focus on what we've lost, then we can't come to grips with what we're missing and what we have to strive to replace. For example, you tell a swinging bachelor, you're not married. He said, I know that. And he probably thinks about it infrequently. But you tell a person who is happily married and is now a widower that they need to get remarried, they know that very, very well. We have to recognize, and this the rabbis teach us, that the hardships that befall us are by virtue of the fact, consequential, that the Jewish lives we're supposed to live, are not in their fullest because of the absence of the temple and the temple-focused life. And the reason we mourn is to keep the memory alive. It says in Parashat Vayeshev, it's really Gemara Pesachim, but the Torah says it's the Torah. Rashi explains that after Yosef was taken by his brothers and they brought back his coat stained with blood, and they said to the father, a wild animal has eaten him, and Yaakov could not be consoled. And the rabbis teach the reason he couldn't be consoled is somehow, if someone is dead, the heart understands this. But if the person is still alive, the message doesn't get through. We commemorate the temple because we can't allow it to be totally destroyed. It's still alive in our minds. There's no better example in my mind than the Holocaust, where we mourn over a third of our people. How we commemorate this is a very tricky question. I often ask, I'm a senior docent in Yad Vashem. When I give tours, I ask, what is it that we lost 1.5 million children at the hands of the 1.5 million children under the age of 12 at the hands of the Nazis? What would be an appropriate way to commemorate 1.5 million children? Usually I'm told schoolyards, playgrounds, which is fine with me. But I think to myself, what about 1.5 million more? What about 1.5 million more children? It strikes me as an even more appropriate way. I'm sure you're familiar with the Aztecs and the Incas. I see one nod and one yes. The Aztecs told you that story. It is no more. We don't want on the wall, here were the Jews, like the Aztecs. The problem is you can make museums and statues and literature, but museums can become mausoleums. And literature can become ephemeral gibberish. And statues can become shards of pottery. We want it to be something where their memory will be continued. There's a story of the Baal Shem. I don't want to sound too sharp, but we say in Hallel, Lo hametin yahalaluka. The dead cannot praise you. I don't want to sound too sharp, but without life, death has no future. We don't want it just to be a sign on the wall. Here were the Aztecs, here were the Jews. So there's a story about the Baal Shem Tov. I assume the name Baal Shem Tov is familiar to you. This time I got 5 nods, we're growing. Baal Shem Tov founded the Hasidic movement. I did one critical mistake. I didn't ask you how long I'm going for. Full 3 hours? Okay. Cruel, unusual punishment. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, the story goes that he would know to go to a forest, and he knew a particular spot in the forest, and he would recite a specific formula, and an angel appeared. 1 generation later, ay, 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 ay. They knew where the forest was, and they knew what the formula was, but they didn't know that specific spot, and an angel did not appear. And 1 generation later, they didn't even remember the formula, and they didn't know that specific spot, but they did know the forest, and clearly an angel did not appear. And we, so many generations later, we don't even know where the forest is. So what do we have? The grandeur and the greatness of the Baal Shem Tov? We have everything, because we have the story, and the story brings us back. We're duty bound to relate the stories of those who perished and the world that was. I know of families, and if I know it, I'm sure you know it, the families at the Seder Shel Pesach, at the very end, the grandmother, the grandfather gets up, relates their survival, and wishes to pass on the baton to the next generation. And I want to make this personal. When I was younger, I'm 27 now. Why is that funny? Anyways, when I was younger, we saw numbers everywhere, numbers engraved in the flesh. And in this regard, I wish to relate 3 stories. In my neighborhood in Jerusalem, which is a pretty devout neighborhood, years ago, Erev Yom Kippur, the eve of Yom Kippur, is the most crowded day in the men mikveh. SRO, squeeze room only. And it's all Hasidim and Yerushalmim talking in Yiddish very boisterously, Good Yom Tov, Good Yor, and everyone's on top of each other. And I cannot describe the story delicately because in a mikveh there's no way to conceal because everything is revealed. And so it's all these Hasidim, Good Yom Tov, Good Yor, and there's one kid from across the street, from the Or Sameach Yeshiva for beginners. How do I know it's from Or Sameach? It said on his t-shirt, Or Sameach Wrestling. And he had an earring and a ponytail. Clearly he was not a Chassid nor Yerushalmi. And he felt legitimately very much out of place. And he placed his arms over his biceps. Very apparent to me and everyone else, they had a tattoo that was not appropriate for the eve of Yom Kippur. I dare say not appropriate for Agans Yor Freilach, but certainly not the eve of Yom Kippur. And the people in this mikveh were not especially subtle, about as subtle as heavy metal is subtle. And they're gawking and gaping. This poor kid was highly embarrassed, about to step into the pool, and he slips and trips. And there's this roaring silence in the mikveh. Sphinx-like silence. Picture a forest after trees felled. Imagine the Mudville Stadium after Mighty Casey struck out. And no one is moving. And these lewd and gaudy tattoos are flying through the air. I cannot describe, I mean I can, but I shan't describe them to you. These were not anchors. In my life, I have never, ever witnessed such embarrassment. He died 1,000 deaths. He turned alabaster. I saw him cogitating he'll jump into the pool and he will never come out. Before the mikveh was so boisterous and noisy, and now it fell silent. You could hear heartbeats. And then, an elderly neighbor of mine, this story happened 29 years ago. An elderly neighbor of mine walked across the moist marble floor 29 years ago, and I can still hear in my ears the thwack, thwack, thwack. He walked across the moist marble floor and he said in his heavily Yiddishy, European accent in English, "Don't William, come on. I also have a tattoo." Pointed the numbers engraved in his flesh. You went through your Gehenna, and I went through my Gehenna. Let's begin Yom Kippur together. Spontaneously, everyone over wished him a Shana Tova and a good Yar, and saw how one thing can make all the difference in the world. Second story. I have a friend, actually, my friend has a friend, it's a friend of a friend. He's a well-known psychiatrist in New York City and Manhattan. And he grew up in Washington Heights in the 1950s. I don't know where you're from, but Washington Heights, it's a Germanic community. In the 1950s, there were so many numbers in everybody's flesh. And in the summer, they would vacation the Rockaways, and at the beach, there were so many numbers you saw. So much so that my friend's friend, said to his mother when he was 9 years old, "When am I going to get my number?" Which caused his mother to run out of the kitchen crying. And this fellow, his name is Ike, his uncle was a physician in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. One day his aunt, the aunt is the husband, is the wife of his uncle, the doctor. She's the doctor's receptionist. She called him and said, "Ike, on Sunday, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the outstanding rabbinic authority of American Jewry, is coming to the clinic. Would you like to meet Rabbi Feinstein?" What kid who grew up in Washington Heights wouldn't give his right arm to meet Rabbi Feinstein? And he comes to the office very early, puts on his Yom Tov finery, scrubs his face. He takes out all these holy books and he's looking very religious. Hajja, 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 hajja. And then the office gets fuller and fuller and fuller. And finally, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and his entourage enter. And his aunt goes over and she says, "Rabbi Feinstein, I'm very sorry, but there's a lot of people here. You're going to have to wait your turn." And she plants a kiss on both of his cheeks. And Ike melts into the floorboards. When he can finally get up, he crawls over and his halting Yiddish, he says, Entschuldigung, my tante, sie ist nicht fromm, sie weiß nicht. I'm so sorry, but my aunt, she's not religious. She doesn't know any better. Said Rav Moshe, she's more holier than I. She has the numbers. Lastly, they asked the Satmar Rebbe, said, Rebbe, when you're not here, whom shall we go to for a blessing? He said, when you go to shul in the morning, you see men putting on their tefillin, you see numbers on their arms, that's their affidavit to go to heaven. Those are people you can ask for a blessing. There's a known rule in storytelling, which is what I do for a living. Audience relates best to a story you can relate. I really don't know how long to. Can you handle 20 minutes without overheating? Honest and true? That wasn't that like real. Yeah. What happens if I speak quickly? Can you listen quickly? Okay, I'm going to give you, trust me, it will not be more than 20 minutes. You're all familiar, I don't know if you're familiar. I assume you're familiar with the story of the SS St. Louis. Okay, the St. Louis was the most famous, perhaps better put, infamous of doomed ships. All the ships were doomed. On board were 976 passengers, Jewish passengers, all of them with legitimate visas, legitimate paperwork to go to Cuba. The ship set sail in May 1939, which means it was after Kristallnacht. Obviously, these Jews were the most wealthy German Jews. If they could afford passage and the paperwork to Cuba, they were very well. That's not important to the story. The boat docks in Havana. It is tethered to the port. You can look up and see the passengers. At this point, the Cubans demand a bribe. In Latin America, Central America, Spanish America, a bribe is a way of life. I'll bet you that the first word you learn in Spanish is el bribo. So if they want a bribe, what should you do? Yeah, very good. I didn't say Staples, that was simple. Nearly 1,000 Jews, their life is on the line. They need a bribe. The leader of American Jewry, anyone? His name was? Correct, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, whom we used to call Haggai, Haggadol Hazeh. Rabbi Wise was the quintessential Reform rabbi, good crop of hair, well-built, stage presence, oratorical abilities, cushy with FDR, Eleanor, members of the cabinet. A bribe's against the law. And the irony of irony was, and that's just not Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, but it's all of a culture Jewry. They wouldn't pay a bribe to get them into Cuba, but had somehow they arrived, and then required millions for education and housing, they would have come up with the money, but not to pay a bribe. The captain of the ship, Gustav Schroeder, a German, was a benevolent, magnanimous humanitarian, and he wanted to save his passengers. But there wasn't a country on the face of the earth that was willing to take them. So go to America. 734 of the 976 had legitimate American visas, but they would only be valid in 3 months' time. How did America greet this boat? With a Coast Guard cutter to intercept. Had somehow they jumped off and swam the 20 miles to Miami, had that been doable, they would have been sent back. At the end, the boat goes back to where it came from, because there wasn't a country on earth that would take them, and many perished in the Holocaust. Which raises the question, what could have been done? And the answer, there were things to do. How many of you, if any, have heard of the Musi negotiations? Okay, that means you don't read enough Teller books, but that's rectifiable. On the table at the end of the war were somewhere between 650 and 800,000 prisoners alive in the camps. Jean-Marie Musi was the former Swiss president. He was a Nazi sympathizer, a chum of Himmler. Himmler was a very dangerous man, the top cop in Germany. So Rabbi Aaron Kudler, the head of the Vad Hatzalah, not to be confused with the ambulance corps, the small group of rabbis dedicated to doing everything they could to try and save Jews in Europe, a dim light in all this darkness. Rabbi Aaron Cutler in America negotiated with the Sternbach family in Switzerland, who negotiated with Jean-Marie Moussi. Something about Moussi changed during the course of the war. Himmler was far more pragmatic than Hitler. He wanted to save his neck, and he negotiated. And he demanded trucks and medicine, which the Vad Hatzalah could not come up with. He then changed his demand to 5 million Swiss francs, the equivalent of $1 million US. The Vad Hatzalah did not have $1 million, but the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, did have $1 million. Now, Rabbi Aaron Cutler was the quintessential Lithuanian yeshivadi, Rosh Yeshiva. Short, long black coat, stooped, holy books under his arm. By looking at him, you could not tell how clever he was. He looked arcane. He did not converse in English, he spoke Yiddish, stooped, maybe even dandruff. And Irving Bunim, the head of Young Israel, was his translator. I might even say his foreign minister. They go before the joint, and Rabbi Aaron Cutler says, which will sound like the super no-brainer, we need $1 million to save these 800,000 Jews. Can you imagine? This would have been the greatest rescue effort in the history of history. Borscht billig, $1 million for 800,000 lives. And the joint says we can't do it. We can't do it because it means violating the British blockade, which was sacrosanct. It's after Pearl Harbor, and it means trading with the enemy, which is a felonious crime. And for all I know, it's a treasonous crime. And yet, to the great rabbis of America, it was despicable to give money to the Nazis. And it was odious to violate American law. And yet, there's a higher law. And the higher law is pikuach nefesh, to save a life. And the higher law is pidyon shvuyim, to rescue a captive. And the higher law is lo ta'amod al dam reyacha, don't stand by your brother's blood. And the higher law is arvut, responsibility, one Jew towards his brother. And Aaron Cutler begs and pleads and cajoles and wheedles, and there's no way he's going to give in. And Aaron Cutler again is begging, we have to save these lives. Finally, the man says, if you can get a license from the American government, we can give $1 million to the Nazi enemy, we'll give you the money. Rabbi Aaron Cutler, with a raging fever, travels to Washington with Irving Bunim, and he goes to the White House. But apparently the president, named after the highway in Manhattan, by the way, FDR, you ask a Jew in the 30s, who was a leader, they would respond in Yiddish, in the drei Welten. Drei Welten, there's 3 worlds. The word for world in Yiddish is Welt. The drei Welten, there's 3 worlds. Der Welt, jener Welt, and the Roosevelt. In the same breath as the world to come. So he goes to the White House, and apparently FDR felt that the plight of 800,000 Jews was not important enough for his time. He sends him to his hyper-assimilated Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. And you can imagine, being a secretary in FDR's cabinet, you had to be an extremely assimilated Jew, which he was. He and his wife celebrated Christmas and Easter, but there's something very Jewish ticking in his heart. He goes before him and says, we need $1 million to save these 800,000 Jews. There is no way that Henry Morgenthau Jr. is going to authorize $1 million of taxpayer money to go to the Nazi enemy. And again, Aaron Cutler begs and pleads and cajoles and wheedles, and he's getting nowhere. Finally, in desperation, he says to Bunim, tell him, you are worthless, and Washington is meaningless if you can't save the life of one child in Europe. There is no way in the world that Irving Bunim is going to tell the Secretary of the Treasury in the White House, you are worthless and Washington is meaningless. So he gives him a milquetoast version. The rabbi's very disappointed. We hope in the future you'll be of greater help. Now, Rabbi Aaron Cutler, as I like to joke, did not understand English, but he was an observant Jew. And he sees from Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s expression that what he had said had not been accurately translated. He said, Tell him precisely what I told you. At that point, Irving Gunem, not about to violate the dictates of the Gadol Hador, the greatest rabbi of the generation, looks down at his shoes to see if his laces are tied and socks are pulled up and other matters of sartorial concern. And he says in the barely audible tone, Mr. Secretary, the rabbis asked me to inform you that you are worthless. And Washington is meaningless if you can't save the life of one child in Europe. At that point, Henry Morgenthau Jr. collapses on the table like this for what appears to be an eternity. When he finally raises his head, his eyes are deltas of red, the tears cascading down his cheeks. He said, "Tell the rabbi I've not forgotten who I am. I'll put my neck on the chopping block to save my brethren." And Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the great hero. Ultimately, the plan was scuttled by American Jewry and Swiss Jewry, and Hitler himself intervened to make sure it wouldn't happen. But Henry Morgenthau Jr. will go down in history as one who was willing to risk his career on behalf of his brethren. Because in life, and this is the great take-home message, in life we have to make decisions. You make the convenient decision, that is the way you'll be forgotten. You make the difficult decision, that is the way you'll be remembered. One last story, which I'm sure you're more familiar with. You didn't really believe me, one last story. Almost one last story. Oskar Schindler was a very problematic individual. He was a womanizer, a dishonest businessman, a boozer, a loan shark, an embezzler, you name it, he was it. But at that critical time, he saved nearly 1,200 Jewish lives. And forever after, he will be known and associated with bravery, courage, self-sacrifice, heroism. Synonymous, his name and self-sacrifice. When I say synonymous, I mean like petroleum jelly and Vaseline, Q-tips and cotton swabs, Kleenex and tissues, plaster, Band-Aid. Did I just say the same thing? We have to make difficult decisions. The convenient ones is how we'll be forgotten. Okay. I just want to end by telling you this really is the one last thing I want to say, is that I work in Yad Vashem. Actually, I volunteer in Yad Vashem. And I wanted to write a particular story. Now, writing about the Holocaust, there is nothing you can write about that has not been written about. The Holocaust is the most documented crime in the history of history. But there is one thing I discovered that had not been written about. And that is, when the war was over, everyone was determined to tell their story and how they had suffered and how they had been abandoned. But the only one who could not tell their story were the children. They didn't speak then, and basically they never spoke. So I went around the world gathering the stories of children. And perhaps you know this if you have grandparents or parents who survived the Holocaust. Children made very severe efforts to forget what happened, understandably. In the late 1980s, it became chic, not very early 1980s, chic to relate Holocaust stories. But by that point, the mind had done tricks. And when I spoke to people, they had fabulous stories, but I knew they couldn't be accurate. The time and the place didn't add up. But ultimately, we came across 9 stories of men, children, girls and boys, religious, not religious, from every corner of the Holocaust kingdom, which betrays from the perspective of a child. It begins when the war broke out, wherever they were, and concludes upon their liberation, with remarkable epilogues. For me, that is the most remarkable story of all, how these people were able to somehow wipe the ashes off their shoulders and lead these fantastic lives, build families, be successful in business, contribute to the community. I have no idea the demons in their heads, but the lives they lead, I don't think I have that wherewithal to do what they did. So in any event, so we wrote this book, we worked on it for 16 years, and then we finally made a very draconian deadline to conclude the book. And we met the deadline, and then we made a little mistake, which is we were about to go to press, and we forgot to produce a cover. Now, a cover is a very important component of a book. Whoever tells me they don't judge a book by its cover, I know they never tried to sell a book. So we had to come up with a cover, so I put my team on it. That's my children. We're blessed with 18 children. And they're going through all the archives. And we came across this picture. I hope you can see from the distance. I think it's a very dramatic picture. It's a picture that was shot on the day that Auschwitz was liberated. It's a picture of hundreds of children. This is just one segment where we zoomed in. And the copyright holder of this picture is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And to use a picture on a book, you need permission. So I requested permission. You have to fill out an affidavit, which I filled out. And it said you cannot make any changes or alterations. You cannot zoom, you cannot colorize. And I wrote, I'm going to make this change and this change and that change and this change and this change and that change. And the next day I had permission. But they sent it to me low resolution. And they said, to get it high res, it will take 3 weeks. 3 weeks, I don't think I had 3 days. And you'll pardon me for being an Israeli, but I thought what I needed to do at this point was protexia, the right connections. And I have a friend in Baltimore, very powerful Jew. They say that in his cell phone he has the private phone number of every senator and congressman. And Washington and Baltimore are neighboring communities. I figured he must have a connection to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It was to me a rhetorical question. And his son was studying in yeshiva right next to my house. So I ran to the yeshiva and said, Aryeh, again, thinking this is a rhetorical question, is your father connected to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington? And he said, no. Shrek and a half. And then I'm disenchanted, crestfallen, melancholy, walking out of the room. I'm just about to cross the threshold, and he tells me, but my mother is on the board. I was going to wring his neck. His mother is a judge, Chaya Friedman. I sent her an email, said, Chaya, I desperately need your help. And I gave her the call number, the lot number of the picture. The next day, I get it, high res. We're all set to go. And then what I wanted to do, my methodology, I told you I give tours in Yad Vashem. What is the most famous story of the Holocaust? Not a hard question. Anne Frank. Don't get swell-headed. Correct. That's the right answer. Now, Anne's story is not a reflective story. She wasn't in the ghettos, wasn't in the camps. She had a roof over her head, a modicum of food. But because it's a story, it's easy to relate. At any time in Yad Vashem, there are so many guides on spooling data that the head cannot absorb. It's just too much information. 15 different countries, 6 years, different regimes. So what I do is I tell stories, and from that, convey the information. So what I wanted to do in sync with my methodology was highlight, to colorize one child in the picture. And I realized that to do this, I'm going to need permission. I can't just do that and put it on the book cover. So again, I send an email to Judge Friedman and said, Chaya, I desperately need your help. I'm going to press, ask for permission that I can colorize one of the children in the picture. I want to make it unique, that it's an individual, not just, because the whole picture is sepia, I want to highlight one individual. And she writes back, she's convening a murder trial, and she has no time. So I wrote her, Chaya, this is killing me. I need you, please. I prevailed upon her. And she writes me back, yay, yay, nay, nay. I made the request. I cannot assure you they're going to agree. And I'm thinking to myself, come on. This is the Holocaust. It's apple pie. It's mom. No one's going to have a problem. That night we had, I'll use the technical term, we had a press queue in the largest press in Israel, arguably in the Middle East. When you have a press queue, it was at 10 o'clock at night, we have a press queue. If you don't show up, you pay for the press queue, and then you get online all over again. You don't just print the next day. So at 10 o'clock at night, we have the plates are burned, they're on the drums. 3 hours before press queue, or to be more accurate, 2 hours and 48 minutes, I get an email from the head archivist, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Dear Rabbi Teller, we regret to inform you, you may not use the picture. Because if you want to use it in its pristine state without any zooming or colorization or changing anything or making it too narrow, then you may. Otherwise, the slightest change, you don't have permission. And particularly that you want to highlight this boy Our legal department said unequivocally, you may not, because he recently spoke out, he's very sensitive. They said, you may not do this. Shrek. So, but I'm not such a pushover, a little bit of a fighter. I write back, please, give me his name and his phone number. I wish to speak with him. 1 hour and 26 minutes for a press queue. She sends me back a news clipping of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and it shows these people, these children, now in the grips of old age, pointing to themselves in the picture. It was apparent, I'll use the yeshivish term, it was mashma from this clipping that this boy's name is Hirsch, and if it is Hirsch, he lives in Europe. I now had an hour and 3 minutes to find Hirsch in Europe. And I don't know if that's his first name or his last name. So Sherlock Teller is thinking, now if you look at the picture, the kid looks pretty good. So I knew right away he couldn't be a Pole. A Pole couldn't look this good. To look this good, you have to be Hungarian. Hungary was invaded March 1944. To be in this shape, you'd have to be Hungarian. So I'm thinking to myself, where in the world, Sherlock Teller is thinking, where would, we're now 48 minutes to press queue, where would a Hungarian survivor of Auschwitz live in Europe today if this was him? And I concluded, England, no. Russia, Eurasia, no. I figured it had to be either Belgium or Switzerland. And then I remembered, I have a very good friend in Zurich. Moshe Loser is his name, and he works for IBM. What a shidduch. So now, 36 minutes to press queue, I call my friend Moshe Loser, and Moshe Loser, I need you to find me Hirsch in Switzerland, Holocaust survivor. He said, would that be his first name or his last name? He said, I don't know. Is he a religious man? I said, I don't know. He said, Chanoch, what are you drinking? He said, I'm not drinking anything. I got 23 minutes, I gotta find this guy Hirsch. He said, listen, I got IBM in my fingertips. You give me his name, I'll find him. I said, you know what? I'm sure he's Hungarian. Try Gabor or Tibor Hirsch. Gabor or Tibor is Hungarian for Mike or Steve. I hear him typing and he says, Gabor Hirsch, 89-year-old engineer, here's his phone number. 9 minutes to press queue, I call him up in my Hoche Deutsch. I ask for permission, which he gives me, and in my first phone call, I got through to him. I fire off an email to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I say, I have permission. If you have any questions, here's his phone number. I wouldn't call him now, it's 9 o'clock at night in Switzerland. And I want you to know, it'd be harder for me to parallel park than it was for me to get him on the first number. I took that as an omen. Baruch Hashem, the book is making an impression, even all over the world. A lady came to my house this Shabbat, not a Jewish woman. Her husband is a colonel in the United States Marines, stationed, he's based in Beaufort, South Carolina, and she told me that a colleague of her husband, before he sends troops to deploy, he gives them this book to read, to give them the courage that they need. Okay, anyways, thank you very much. Thank you for bearing with me. Sorry for my being late. In the back, I think you'll find books which you'll find enriching. I know I will. And the deal is, if you buy 2 books, the third one is free. If you buy 4 books, 2 are free. If you buy 6 books, I pay you.